Hello and welcome to ThePrint. This is Bidisha and you're watching Economics. Over the last few days, Venezuela has once again returned to global headlines. This time, not because of oil prices or elections, but because of an unprecedented political and military intervention. On the 3rd of January, the United States removed President Nicolás Maduro from office, extradited him to the United States to face criminal charges, and an interim government was installed in Caracas. Washington has also announced that it will now oversee Venezuelan oil sales and how those revenues are spent. Almost immediately, a familiar explanation has resurfaced that Venezuela's economy collapsed, that this is a sudden crisis, that this is the result of recent political mistakes or sanctions. But this explanation is deeply misleading because the Venezuelan economy did not collapse overnight. What we are seeing today is the end result of 4 decades of economic stagnation. And to understand that properly, we need to step back from the drama of the present and look carefully at the data. Let's begin with the maps on your screen. These maps show GDP per capita adjusted for purchasing power parity or PPP. In simple terms, this tells us how well people actually live, what their incomes can buy inside their own economy. It is the most reliable long-term measure of living standards. The map on your left is 1980. At that time, South America looks surprisingly equal. Most countries fall into similar income ranges, and Venezuela stands out, not at the bottom, but near the top. At just under $8,000 per person, Venezuela is richer than Brazil, far richer than Colombia, and broadly comparable to Argentina. This is an important starting point. Venezuela did not begin this period as a poor or disadvantaged country. It began as one of the most affluent economies in the region. Now shift your attention to the map on the right, 2023. The transformation across the continent is dramatic. Chile, Uruguay, and Argentina have moved decisively into high-income categories. Brazil has more than quadrupled its average income. Colombia, once far behind Venezuela, has clearly overtaken it. And Venezuela? Venezuela's color barely changes. Its income level in 2023 is almost the same as it was 4 decades ago. This single visual captures the core story. Venezuela did not suddenly fall, it was overtaken. While the rest of South America climbed the income ladder, Venezuela stayed on the same rung. This is exactly what long-term stagnation looks like. Now let's add time to this picture. The next graph tracks GDP per capita year by year from 1980 till 2023. Each grey line represents a South American country. The red line is Venezuela. First, notice the regional pattern. Most countries experience ups and downs, debt crisis, commodity shocks, political instability, but over the long run, their trend is clearly upward. That is what normal economic development looks like. Now focus on Venezuela. In the early years, its trajectory looks broadly similar to the rest of the region. Then something changes. During oil booms, its income rises, but it never really stays up. Each increase is followed by stagnation or decline. There is no sustained upward trend. Over time, the gap between Venezuela and its neighbors widen, slowly at first and then decisively. This graph tells us something very crucial. Venezuela did not experience a single dramatic collapse. It experienced repeated failure to convert temporary booms into long-term growth. Economies can recover from recessions. What they cannot survive is decades without trend growth. And that is exactly what happened here. The final graph explains why. Now, this chart plots two things together. The grey dashed line shows oil production, and the red line shows GDP per capita, living standards. Now, look at how these two lines interact. During periods of rising oil production, especially in the 1990s and the mid-2000s, incomes do rise. Oil money does raise living standards. But notice what never happens. Those gains are not sustained. Each oil boom produces a temporary lift followed by stagnation. The revenues are consumed, not invested. There is no lasting increase in productivity, diversification, or even economic capacity. Now look at what happens when oil production begins to fall in the mid-2010s. Because Venezuela never built a diversified economy, incomes collapse along with the oil output. This is a textbook example of the resource curse. Oil wealth created the illusion of prosperity without building the foundations needed to even sustain it. Instead of using oil revenues to create a broader economy, Venezuela became increasingly dependent on oil itself. When oil failed, everything failed. Taken together, these three graphs tell a single coherent story. The maps show that Venezuela started relatively rich and stood still while others advanced. The income trajectories show decades of stagnation, not a sudden crisis. And the oil graph shows why. Oil revenues were used to finance consumption rather than long-term investment. This perspective also helps us understand sanctions. Sanctions have unquestionably intensified suffering in the recent years. But they cannot explain 4 decades of stagnation, right? Venezuela failed to converge with the rest of South America long before sanctions even existed. Sanctions did not create the problem, they rather exposed it. Economic crises are dramatic. They arrive suddenly, they dominate headlines, they feel urgent. Economic stagnation is quieter and far more destructive. When an economy fails to grow for decades, infrastructure ages, skills become obsolete, institutions weaken, and opportunities disappear. People don't leave because growth slows for 1 year. They leave when growth disappears for an entire generation. That is why Venezuela's humanitarian crisis feels sudden, but it is not. It is the delayed consequence of prolonged economic erosion finally reaching its limit. There is a broad lesson here, not just for Venezuela. Natural resources do not guarantee prosperity. Redistribution without productivity does not create growth. And political narratives cannot substitute for institutions that reward investment, innovation, and work. Venezuela began this period with advantages that many countries would envy. It ended it having lost an entire generation of economic progress. Not through sudden collapse, but through the slow cumulative damage of stagnation. So when we ask, how did Venezuela collapse? We are asking the wrong question. The right question is, how did Venezuela stop growing and remain stagnant for 40 years? Once you answer that, the crisis stops looking sudden. It starts looking inevitable.